We are the Borg. No, I'm just kidding. Hi. Hi, guys. How is it going? So, 1,000 pine points to Raimi Gildas for being here first. And by the way, I need you guys show you something. And it's this. We have, unlike Pine Creek, the official Canon Cam Pine Point ledger. So unlike the official Pine Creek DAX channel, where of course all the Pine Points come from, uh, we here are for complete transparency. So yeah, here it is. So I'll just add Raimi here, and we can see how he's doing. These are all of the Pine Points that I've ever given out to you guys, usually for being here first, but it includes everything. And as we can see, there are now 3 people who are tied for the first place. That's Nathan, Roman, and Raimi now. And I will keep the link to the ledger in the description of every video so that you can keep checking it out. Because let's face it, this is definitely much, much better than these anonymous corporations such as the head office in Wichita, Kansas, head Pine Creek office in Wichita, Kansas, right? This isn't any anonymous corporation here in Can-Am-Cam. We are actually running a worker co-op, so every employee gets to vote, and every employee is entitled to the fruits of their labor. And obviously, this comes with full transparency. So that's one thing I wanted to show you before we start. Also, I was recently interviewed on this here channel. It's my favorite Robert and Brian podcast. No, I'm just kidding. It's of course Smith Vision. Here I am. Ran by Derek. Definitely check it out. Subscribe if you're not already. I'm of course subscribed. I'm just using a different browser for this. So yeah, I was recently on, so we might have a lot of newcomers, actually, new subscribers, because I timed the release of this stream with the interview that I did. It's about the resurrection, and it's basically outlining my alternative explanation for the evidence for the resurrection. So if you're interested in that, definitely check it out. And there is one specific thing that I want to endorse. That's basically this. It's GoFundMe that Derek put up for interviewing Bart Ehrman because he is doing interviews with scholars. He has had a lot of really interesting scholars on, not only Robert Price, but also, for example, Mark Goodacre or Dennis MacDonald. And he wants to interview Bart Ehrman. And he's raising money to cover the expenses because a very large percentage of this amount, almost all of it, is actually the amount that Bart Ehrman charges for 2 hours of his time. And I think this is worth it because it would be an opportunity to ask Bart Ehrman questions that he haven't honestly been asked before. If the money is collected, I will probably have I will advise Derek about some interesting questions, maybe. So if you think that I can think of like interesting questions to ask Bart Ehrman about, then feel free to donate. This is not my GoFundMe, it's Derek's, so I won't get anything out of that. But I was told that Derek has very expensive professional equipment, and I thought it would be interesting to have this kind of production in connection with Bart Ehrman. And I actually wanted to donate live on stream to show you that I'm, taking this seriously and I'm participating. But then I found out I actually don't have any money. So I'll have to do it either next week or the week after that, after I get the November salary. So yeah, the link to the GoFundMe is also in the video description of this stream. So yeah, that's it. And let's go to the topic of this video, right? So I was told that I should be much more nuanced when it comes to my presentation. But you have to realize that I need to put up like clickbait titles, right? So that I attract some new subscribers and new viewers. So the title of this stream is "The Lukan Authorship Destroyed by One Simple Argument." But given that you are now already here and you clicked the video, I think a much more appropriate, much more nuanced title would be the Lucan authorship made somewhat less probable by an extremely complicated argument, right? But I think you will still find it interesting. Um, so we are going to be talking about this small piece of research. It's a paper that was published in 2015 in the Journal of Biblical Literature. The author is Ryan S. Schellenberg, who is a scholar who's active in the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. And judging from just looking at his other publication, it seems that he's mostly focusing on Paul and more specifically on his rhetorical education, which I think is interesting. The title of the article that we are going to be looking at is "The First Pauline Chronologist, Paul's itinerary in the Letters and in Acts." And again, you are going to see the link to the journal article in the description of the video. It's behind a paywall, but hey, it never stopped me before, so I'm sure you guys will manage to get the article somehow. I'm not going to tell you how, but I think you get the idea. So why is this interesting for the question of Lucar authorship? Well, the research question of the journal article is this: did the author of Acts, whoever that might be, use the extant letters of Paul, so the letters of Paul that we have, as a source of information about Paul's itinerary when it comes to missionary journeys, right? Because, of course, in the book of Acts, there are several missionary journeys, especially in the second part of the book of Acts, which focuses mainly on Paul, as opposed to the first part of Acts that mostly focuses on events immediately following Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and following Peter and other members of the early church, right? And what's very important for this article is that in Acts, it describes where Paul traveled during these missionary journeys and what happened to these various locations. And really, there are basically three hypotheses about that are relevant to authorship, right? The first is that the author basically deduced or put together or lifted various places in this Paul in these Paul missionary journeys from the Pauline letters. So he just used the Pauline letters as a source for these places when he constructed his narrative. The second hypothesis is that the author used an independent source, so a different source, either written or oral, that was not aware and what was not itself informed by the Pauline letters. This has been proposed already in literature. This is called this is so-called itinerary source. And the third explanation is that the author of Acts, of course, was the traveling companion of Paul. So, really, the source of these missionary journeys and the various locations that Paul visits is the author himself, right? That's, of course, everyone's favorite hypothesis. And this is what we are going to be looking at. And the article is talking about one specific piece of evidence, which, in the opinion of the author, makes the first hypothesis most probable, right? Again, that's the hypothesis. Then, when constructing the narrative of these missionary journeys, the author of Acts used the Pauline letters as a source. So let's go into it. So Schellenberg first asks if the author of Acts could have deduced Paul's itinerary from the letters, right? So he's basically just looking for a proof of concept, basically just answering a basic question. Okay, is my hypothesis even viable? Is this something that plausibly could have been done? We are going to be talking about plausibility of the hypothesis a little bit later, but this is just in the introduction, kind of like, is this even a thing? Like, is it worth checking it out, right? And he basically answers yes. So just look at let's just look at the book of Acts, right? So in Acts we have several missionary journeys of Paul, and in these missionary during the description of these missionary journeys, the author of Acts is mentioning various names of places. These are called toponyms, so they are names for places like Athens, Jerusalem, and so on. So that those wouldn't be names like Paul, that's not a toponym. So, for example, in Act 16, which is one of the, I think it's the second missionary journey of Paul, it says, they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So, passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. So, if you don't know where these places are, if you imagine the map of what's today's Turkey, they were basically going through inlands towards the sea, and they ended up in Troas, which is, of course, the region where the city of Troy was, right? The city of Ilion. And everyone obviously know where that is, right? Everyone would be able to find it on a map, I'm sure. So these are the names of places that we are going to be looking at today. And what Schellenberg noticed is that there is something fishy about it, which very strongly points in the direction that the author of Acts used the Pauline letters as a source for these toponyms, for these place names, right? But just to get back to what I was talking about, in the first section of the article, he's basically asking the question, is this even a thing? Is it like a viable hypothesis? And here what he says about it. So first, to what extent can the itinerary of Acts 16 to 20, those are the several missionary journeys of Paul, or more precisely, 1536 to 2016, be explained as Luke's deduction from his reading of Paul's letters? And second, are these features of the narrative that makes this explanation preferable to other common proposals, specifically that Luke had access to an independent itinerary source, or was a traveling companion of Paul? So in this passage, he's basically laying down these three different hypotheses that we were talking about, right? And then he goes on to say, if, as I will propose, it can be demonstrated that there are no significant barriers to viewing Paul's letters as a primary source of Luke's itinerary, and further that this explanation mitigates difficulties inherent in other proposals, this would provide strong confirmation of the explanatory value of the hypothesis, right? So just to reiterate, he's basically laying down these three alternative hypotheses. And then in the second passage that I've just quoted, he basically says, okay, I'm going to demonstrate that my hypothesis doesn't really have any fatal flaws. Moreover, so it's viable. Moreover, it has additional explanatory power. It has more explanatory power compared to the two alternative explanations. One being that the author of Acts used an itinerary source, not the Pauline letters. And the second hypothesis that the author of Acts was actually a traveling companion of Paul. So if my hypothesis has some additional explanatory power, there are things that it can explain better than these alternative hypotheses, then we should prefer it, right? It's more probable. It's more probable that this is the case. And he focuses on one specific piece of evidence where he thinks that his hypothesis wins. He thinks that this is a piece of evidence which is better explained by this hypothesis than the alternatives, right? So he first goes on to kind of see if it's possible, if it's even plausible for the author of Acts to use the extant Pauline letters. It's very important that we are talking about the letters that were attributed to Paul, which either Paul really wrote or he didn't write them, right? So that includes the forgeries that we have in the New Testament today. And only the extant letters, right? So he's not proposing, at least at this stage, that there are letters which are not extant, and he's just checking if it would be possible to lift these names of places from the Pauline letters. And he basically says it should be clear, with only one or two exceptions, and we are going to get to those exceptions later. The basic framework of Paul's itinerary in these chapters can easily be explained as Luke's deduction from a few key passages in the letters. These need not have been open before our author, nor, for the most part, recalled with any great precision. In fact, a fairly general familiarity with what Paul had written, combined with a willingness creatively to connect the dots, could have sufficed to suggest these routes. So here, Schellenberg is basically saying, look, it's possible, right? There isn't any fatal flaw. We can certainly imagine that the author of Acts knew about the extant Pauline letters. He was vaguely familiar with them. He knew what kind of places they mention, and he could have just created narratives of these missionary journeys using the names of places that are found in these letters. Cool. So let's just start there and let's go on, right? Uh, so let's now look at the explanatory power. And I can, for example, use the analogy that djump uses all the time, right? So let's say there is a box and we don't know what's in the box, right? And there are two hypotheses. Either it's a duck or it's a lizard. And we can't look into the box, so we don't know, right? And if someone suggests, okay, the box weighs 10 pounds, and that means there's a lizard in it, well, that's not really evidence that would favor one hypothesis over the other, because a duck can also weigh 10 pounds, right? But then if we hear quacking coming out of the box, that could count as evidence that there is actually a duck in it, because as far as we know, we are being informed by our background knowledge, right? By what we already know about how the world works, that normally lizards don't really quack, but ducks do. So this observation, the sound that we are hearing, plus the existing background knowledge, raise the probability of the hypothesis that there is a duck in the box, right? Because that's expected on the hypothesis and not expected on the alternative hypothesis, on the lizard hypothesis. So, and Schellenberg is basically saying, look, there is something in the Acts when we compare, in the book of Acts, if we compare it to the extant Pauline letters, that is equivalent of us hearing quacking coming out of the box. So that's not like those 10 pounds, right? That's just us having a piece of evidence, having some kind of observation that raises the probability of the hypothesis that the author of Acts used the Pauline letters as a source for constructing these itinerary journeys over the hypothesis that he actually was a traveling companion. And it's this. So what are we looking at? I'll just give you a moment to appreciate the beauty of the visualization. This is, by the way, not from Schellenberg's article. This is what I put together for this presentation. And let me just drink some water. So these are toponyms, so names of places from the specific section of Acts that Schellenberg is looking at. And they are basically contained in two sets, and there is an overlap. So the blue set are all the toponyms that are located, that can be found in the extant Pauline epistles, right? So, for example, Paul, when he's writing to his churches, mentions Galatia, he mentions Corinth, he mentions Athens, he mentions Philippi. Those are all the places that we can find when we read the letters of Paul. And then everything in the orange set are locations that are mentioned in this specific segment of Acts, in these specific few chapters of Acts. So, for example, Syria, again, Athens, there is the famous scene of Paul speaking to the philosophers at Areopagos, right, in Athens, Neapolis, Samothrace. These are all the places that are mentioned in Acts. As you can see, there is an overlap, right? So it's the case that there is a lot of places which are mentioned both in Acts in the Pauline and in the Pauline letters. There are also places that are mentioned in the Pauline letters, but they are not mentioned in Acts. There's only very few of them. In fact, there are only three: Arabia, Spain, and Illyricum. And then, importantly, there are places which are not only mentioned in Acts, and they are nowhere to be found in the Pauline letters. So these are places which are only mentioned by the Lukan author, but Paul never mentions them, or Paul's forgers don't mention them in the letters that we have. These are, for example, Chios, Samos, Mysia, Apollonia, and so on. And this hypothesis that the author of Acts was using Paul's letters as a source is not new. It's been floating around in scholarship. And when scholars thought about it and argued that the author of Acts was not using Pauline's letters, they said something like this. Well, if we construct this Venn diagram, we can see that, yeah, there is some partial overlap of the toponyms, but there is not perfect overlap, right? So it's not the case that every location mentioned in Acts is also mentioned in the Pauline epistles. So the hypothesis that the Pauline epistles are the source behind Acts is very improbable. There must be some additional source of information that the author of Acts is using, because where else did he get all of those toponyms from, right? He didn't get all of them from the Pauline epistles. This was the argumentation. It has been the argumentation in literature, at least of some scholars. But that's right. Like the overlap isn't perfect. The Venn diagram, it's not like one set is a subset of the other. There's just a partial overlap. But there's something really, really interesting that Schellenberg mentioned. And if you look at it, if you look at the chart or the diagram for a while, you will see it. It has to do with the coloring of the toponyms. And this is something that Schellenberg pointed out. So just to reiterate, in the diagram, the blues, everything in the blue box, in the blue set, are toponyms that are mentioned in the extant Pauline epistles, and everything in the orange set are the toponyms mentioned in Acts. As we can see, there is overlap. And now what's very important is that the toponyms in red are places where some action is situated. So in the narrative, something actually happens, something important, something that there is some narration, like there are some characters, there are some events taking place. Usually it has to do with Paul preaching, usually in a synagogue. Something happens. For example, the local Jews are discontent with that. They try to murder him, so they plot against him. Maybe there are some miracles, something like that. But there is some kind of action, right? So those are the toponyms that are marked in red. That would be, for example, Lystra, Troas that we've just mentioned, Athens, right? So the reason why in the diagram Athens is in red is because in Acts, there is action taking place in Athens. Specifically, Paul goes to Areopagos and he talks to the philosophers there. And then everything that is in black are places which are mentioned in Acts, but nothing happens there. So if nothing happens there, why are they mentioned? Well, they are mentioned just in passing. They are usually in strings, kind of close together, in one sentence or a couple of sentences, and they are usually in passages which describe like which way Paul traveled, right? So if you look at the structure of this specific segment of Acts, you can essentially break it down into two components. That is the narrative, the narration that it describes the actual events, and there is this kind of connecting tissue, which tells you, okay, and from here, Paul went to there, from A to B. And on the way, he traveled through these locations, right? And we've already seen that So we've seen one passage in Acts that contains exactly this connecting issue. It says, okay, Paul started in Phrygia, in Galatia and Phrygia. He wanted to go to Mysia, but the Holy Ghost prevented him from going there, so he ended up in Troas. As we can see, Mysia, Phrygia, and Troas are all actually Troas is not in black, but Mysia and Phrygia are in black because nothing happens there. They are just mentioned as locations through which Paul traveled or close to which Paul traveled. And what's very, very important is that if you look at the diagram, with just two exceptions, everything in the overlap is red and everything outside the overlap is black. And this is the important pattern that Schellenberg realized. Okay, now you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? Or you have no idea why this is important. So let me explain, right? So everyone agrees that both the letters of Paul and the material in Acts is selective. The Pauline letters, the letters of Paul that we now have, are selective because everyone realizes that Paul wrote more than what we have. For example, because he quotes letters that we don't have, right? Like in the extant letters, he actually mentions letters that he had written before, but those letters are not preserved. They were forged. We have, for example, 3 Corinthians, 3rd Corinthians, right? But a lot of those letters were lost. And of course, it's very, very probable that Paul didn't just write the letters that we have and letters that he mentioned. It's actually probable that he wrote many, many more letters to various churches that are not preserved, and he just happened not to mention them in the letters that were preserved, right? So really the body, the amount of text that we have is selective. Those are just letters that we happened to have. Those are the letters that happened to be preserved. And what's important is that the specific collection of letters seems to be the case is only seen together after a certain period of time. And this is because when we see these letters being mentioned, for example, being quoted by other authors, early on, they usually quote one letter or they quote like 1 and 2 letters together. But really, it's only after a certain period of time when we see this collection of letters that we have today in the New Testament showing up, kind of, the letters together. And that is the case both for when the letters are being referred to in other sources, and also when the letters start showing up in the manuscript tradition. So not only are the letters selective, so we only happened to have a certain collection of letters, but also it seems to be the case that originally the letters only circulated either individually or in smaller groups. That is the full corpus of the Pauline letters that we have today. And only later, where they circulated roughly in the same composition that we have it today, right? So those specific letters grouped together. So that's one kind of side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that, again, everyone agrees that Acts is selective. So Acts isn't describing anything that actually happened. Like even people who think that Acts is historically reliable, that it was written by an eyewitness who was a traveling companion of Paul, even those people realize and recognize that Acts is not describing everything. The author is being selective, right? There must have been many, many more things that happened, and Acts just doesn't record it, right? And of course, people who recognize that Acts is mostly fiction, if not exclusively fiction, still realize that Acts is being selective. So there would have been events that the author could have also invented, but he didn't. So if both the surviving letters of Paul are selective and Acts is selective, why is it the case that there is this pattern why is it the case that the locations where action takes place in the narrative just happened to be the locations that are mentioned in the Pauline corpus, right? So again, let's just reiterate. If it's the case that the collection of surviving Pauline letters is very selective, and we just happened to have these letters, right? And they were probably grouped together after a while, not immediately. And if it's the case that Acts is selective, it's not narrating everything that could have narrated, why is it the case that it just happens to be that all the locations where action takes place are locations that are also found in the surviving letters of Paul that we happened to have? This is really weird, right? Because surely in the letters of Paul that Paul actually wrote are lost, surely he mentioned other locations, right? I mean, he mentions locations in the letters that we have, so it's very, very probable that he mentioned, more locations in the letters that we don't have. And surely, even if you think that Acts is historically reliable, there were things that happened to Paul somewhere else than in the places which names are found in the letters that we just happened to have, right? Isn't this weird? Isn't it a weird coincidence that every time in this specific segment of Acts, when action takes place, it always takes place in a location that just happens to be mentioned in the letters that we just happened to have today, right? That are in those letters that survived. And this is what Schellenberg thinks is evidence pointing very strongly in favor of the hypothesis that the author of Acts actually drawn these locations, these toponyms, from the extant letters of Paul. The letters of Paul that he happened to have available, which are, of course, the same letters that we have today, because those were the ones that were preserved. So this is what Schellenberg says about it. Is it only a coincidence that with the sole exception of Beroe, cities named in Acts 16 to 20 fall neatly into two categories. First, those that are absent from Paul's letters, and regarding which Luke tells us nothing except that Paul came and went. So those would be the toponyms in black. And second, those that do appear in Paul's letters and also provide the setting for extended Lukan narrative. So those would be the places in red. To my mind, the fact that the list of Luke's redundant toponyms, that is, those places mentioned only in passing, so those are the black names, right, is almost precisely coextensive with the list of those cities unique to Acts, is most credibly explained as a result of Luke's dependence for his primary toponyms on his knowledge of the Pauline corpus. So again, just to go back, right? What's the quacking sound, right? So I made the analogy with the box. The box weighs 10 pounds. That's not evidence that would allow us to differentiate between the duck hypothesis and the lizard hypothesis, right? But then we hear quacking coming out of the box. So in the analogy, the quacking is this. It's the fact that in this diagram, the overlap of the two sets is red. And almost everything that's outside the overlap in the diagram is black. That's the thing that is just like massively improbable on the hypothesis that the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul. But it's very, very probable on the hypothesis that the author of Acts actually wasn't a traveling companion of Paul. And when he constructed these narratives of the missionary journeys, he just picked names of places from the Pauline letters in order to make it look more plausible, more like historically reliable. He put them together. He created the narratives set in those places and nowhere else. And then he sprinkled these other locations in these like very brief passages which don't narrate any action. They just describe where Paul went, the regions through which and the cities through which Paul went from these various places of action, right? That's the basic idea. Yeah. Okay. And there is something really interesting about it, right? So let's just look at this map. This is what I created. So this is basically the diagram showed on a map. So again, we have places in red. These are places where some action takes place. So Paul stops and he does something, something happens. So here again, for example, we have Athens in red, which is where the famous episode at the Areopagos takes place. And then the locations in black are just mentioned in passing. They are just mentioned because Paul went through them, right? So I'll just give you a moment to look at the map. And again, the point is that the red location, those are the locations that we find in the Pauline letters. And the black locations are the locations that we don't find in the Pauline letters. Isn't it weird that like everything substantial that happens in Acts also happens in locations that just happened to be included in the letters that we just happened to have? Like surely if you think that Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul, there must have been things that happened in other locations that were noteworthy, right? Acts is being selective. So if you imagine that this Lukan author selected material, he was thinking, okay, which stories I want to include. Is it a coincidence that he ended up including stories which are set in locations that are found in the body of letters that we happened to have? That's like a massive coincidence. But it's expected on the hypothesis that this is actually the source that the author is using. And that is this interesting case of Galatia. So you can see the Galatia, you can see the region of Galatia on the right-hand side of the map. It's inland Turkey. And Paul, in Acts, Paul visits Galatia twice. That is this pattern in this section of Acts where Paul actually goes through the same region twice very often, right? So he kind of repeats the same journey essentially, or at least he visits the location twice. And what's very, very interesting is that in Acts, it's narrated that Paul traveled through Galatia twice, but it never mentions any locations in Galatia. It never mentions any cities in Galatia. And there were cities in Galatia, right? We know about them. For example, if you play Rome Total War, you know that Ancyra was a location in Galatia. It was a city in the ancient world, right? And it's not like he doesn't mention cities anywhere else, right? He mentions, for example, Neapolis, he mentions Amphipolis, he mentions Apollonia, he mentions Philippi, Thessalonica, you know. So isn't that a little bit fishy that he, goes through a region twice and doesn't mention any names? Why is it the case? Could it be the case that in the Pauline letters, there are no names of cities in Galatia? So the author of Acts didn't have anything to work with, right? That's a good explanation. We, of course, knew that Paul was active in Galatia because that was a letter to the Galatians. So clearly, Paul must have visited there in order to establish the church that he's writing the letter to Galatians to. But in the letter to Galatians, and nowhere else in the surviving Pauline letters, does Paul name drops any names of locations, cities in Galatia. So we don't find any in Acts. That's really interesting, right? Okay, so that's the basic gist. I hope that you understood what I'm trying to say. And let's go through the rest of the article. Schellenberg also mentions some language, which is very similar between Acts and the Pauline letters. And really, I would say this is not the main the strongest point of the article, because this has been argued very extensively in literature already. Like there are probably hundreds of articles and books that deal specifically with this issue. Like, is it the case that the language that is being used, the specific vocabulary, the specific expression, syntax, and stuff like that in Acts is sufficiently similar to what we find in the surviving Pauline letters that this establishes direct genetic link between the two texts, right? So is it the case that what Paul says and what Luke says is so similar that it's very, very probable that Luke just had a copy of the Pauline letters in front of him when he was writing Acts. So that's also included in the article. Again, I don't think this is the most interesting because, to be honest, I don't think the parallels are super strong. If they were strong, many, many more New Testament scholars would be convinced that the author of Acts actually used the Pauline letters as a source. And then he goes on to talk about plausibility. So, how is it plausible that the author of Acts would use information from the Pauline letters in this way? And this is really interesting because Schellenberg actually compares what his hypothesis would demand from the author of Acts when it comes to composition of these missionary journeys. And he compares that with how the author of Acts, who was also the author of the Gospel of Luke, uses a different written source that we know about, namely the Gospel of Mark, because everyone pretty much recognizes that the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts were written by the same author, and everyone recognizes that the author of Luke, so the author of Acts, used the Gospel of Mark as a source. So we can actually investigate what kind of reduction practices the author of Luke is in a habit of using, because we can just look at what he's doing with the Gospel of Mark. And we can see if that thing would be applicable in this hypothesis, right? So if it would make sense for him to take the Pauline letters and construct out of them Pauline missionary journeys. And he, for example, finds out, Schellenberg, for example, finds out, you are not, this is not going to be readable, but that's okay, I'll just explain. The author of Luke feels free to rearrange material. We know that because this is what he does to the Gospel of Mark. So if you actually compare the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, you can see that there are differences. For example, and this is what's shown here, the important part of this is that what you're supposed to be noticing is this passage, which moves from the beginning in the Gospel of Mark, which is on the left-hand side, to the end of the appropriate section in the Gospel of Luke. That's on the right-hand side. And this is specifically the call to the apostles. So in the Gospel of Mark, the call to the apostles takes place immediately after Jesus appears in Galilee. But in the Gospel of Luke, it takes place after Jesus performs his first miracles. And what's very important is that the same miracles are actually narrated in the Gospel of Luke. They are just narrated out of sequence, right? So it's not the case that Luke just omitted them. He has both the call of the apostles and the miracles. He just swaps chronological order, right? And a lot of New Testament scholars think, and this is what I think as well, that the reason why the author of Luke rearranged the material in this specific passage, in this specific segment of the gospel, is that it makes it more believable, it makes it more credible that the apostles would just immediately drop everything and follow Jesus, you know? Like if you I don't know if you ever thought about it, probably yes, right? In the Gospel of Mark, it's really, really strange that like pretty much the first thing that Jesus does when he begins his Galilean ministry is call to the apostles. And what's very weird about it is that if you only had the Gospel of Mark, you would have to imagine that the apostles just heard Jesus calling them, and they immediately dropped everything and they started following him. That's strange. Like, why would they do that, right? That's not like a normal human behavior. I think I can explain like why the author of the Gospel of Mark wrote it that way. We already talked about it, about a similar reason in one of our previous streams. But sounds weird, right? Like it's probably bugging a lot of people. Not everyone gets that. And it was probably bugging the author of the Gospel of Luke as well. For him, it probably didn't make sense. So he just rearranged the passage. So here, Jesus begins his Galilean ministry. He performs a couple of miracles, and then he goes to the apostles. Well, if Jesus was already known, both to the people of Galilee, but maybe more importantly to the listeners, to the audience of the gospel, as someone who performs miracles, it would be much more credible, it would be much more believable to imagine that the apostles would react the way they react. Namely, that they would just drop everything and immediately start following Jesus, right? So that's the basic idea. We see that the author of the Gospel of Luke, who is also the author of the book of Acts, feels free to rearrange the narrative for his own purposes. In this case, to boost the believability, basically, of the narrative, right? He also omits stuff. So if we compare locations that Jesus visits in the Gospel of Mark and locations that Jesus visits in the Gospel of Luke, we see that the author of Luke omitted all kinds of locations. He, for example, never mentions Jesus going to Bethsaida, to Tyre, Sidon. You know, this is the famous geographical error in the Gospel of Mark. Decapolis, Bethsaida, again, he actually omits Jesus going there twice, and stuff like that. So what Schellenberg says, look, it's plausible given that we already see the author of the Gospel of Luke, who is also the author of the Book of Acts, engaging in these kinds of redactional practices. It's plausible that he would do something like what Schellenberg's hypothesis is proposing that he did, namely that he constructed the narrative of the missionary journeys by lifting various locations from the corpus of surviving Pauline epistles. Right. Okay. So let's look at some problems, right? So what are the problems for this view? Well, it doesn't work 100%. I'm sure you've already noticed, right? So the basic idea is that everything in the intersection of these two sets should be in red, and everything outside of it should be in black. But it's not the case. There are two locations which are mentioned in Acts where action takes place during the missionary journeys of Paul, but they are actually not mentioned in the surviving letters of Paul. That's Caesarea or Caesarea. This is not problematic because that just comes from a different written source that we already know the gospel of the author of the book of Acts had, namely the Gospel of Mark, right? So we know that the author of the Gospel of we know that the author of the book of Acts had the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark mentions Caesarea, so that's where he got the toponym from. But then there is this problem of Beroe, which is one location where action takes place. That's the problem because it doesn't appear in the Pauline epistles. So what do we do with that? Does it mean that the hypothesis is completely dead? I don't think so, right? So this is actually a perfect opportunity to talk about the nature of evidence and what exactly do we mean when we say that a piece of evidence makes a hypothesis more probable. So here we are proposing that there is a pattern in these toponyms, which is very, very improbable, on the hypothesis that the Lukan author was a traveling companion of Paul, because we would basically have to posit that this correspondence is coincidental. It just happened to be the case that the traveling companion of Paul just happened to situate all action in the book of Acts, that he's selecting material for. He's not recording everything that happened. It just happens to be the case that all of that action that he selected just happens to take place in places which just happened to be mentioned in a collection of Pauline letters that happened to survive for us today, And this is made even more significant, as I mentioned, by the fact that it seems to be the case that the specific collection of the Pauline letters that we have today was really only circulating as that specific collection later on. So not only, I would say, is this some evidence against the hypothesis that the author of Luke was a traveling companion of Paul and author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul, I would say it might also count as evidence towards the hypothesis that the book of Acts was written late, because it seems to be that a later date is the more probable date for someone in the position of the author of Acts to have that collection of Pauline letters available. In earlier dates, it seems to be that these letters either were circulating in isolation or they were circulating in like smaller subsets, not the entire collection, right? Because when we see them happening, appearing in these earlier dates, this is usually how they show up, right? Not super strong evidence, but fair enough, right? So again, just to reiterate the point, on the hypothesis that the Lukan author was a traveling companion, this is like super crazy coincidence, right? On the other hand, on the hypothesis that the author of Acts used the letters of Paul as a source, this is expected. The problem is doesn't work perfectly. So what we do when we evaluate evidence is basically we look at how well it fits. And specifically, this is what makes it more expected compared to the hypothesis on which it would be expected the distribution of the toponyms would be basically random, right? So on the hypothesis that the Lucan authorship, the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul, it's fair to imagine that the distribution of the toponyms would be essentially equal, or it would be randomly distributed, which means it would be basically equal across the diagram, right? So that's on the diagram that's on the left, right? Various diagrams represent essentially various ways how the data could have been, but isn't, right? So we are in the imagination land, right? We are playing pretend, and we are imagining how this diagram could have looked like, but it doesn't, in like various different possible scenarios, right? So on the left, we have the diagram, how it would look like, I would say, if the author of Acts really was a traveling companion of Paul. Because on that hypothesis, we wouldn't really expect this pattern to be there, right? We would basically expect the toponyms to be pretty much equally distributed across the diagram, right? So the toponyms where action takes place would be the toponyms that are found in the Pauline epistles, but also they would be toponyms that are not found in the Pauline epistles. There wouldn't be any kind of pattern to it. And as we move closer and closer to the right, the pattern starts emerging, right? So as you can see, if you look at it, more and more toponyms where action takes place, those are the toponyms in red, show up in the intersection of the two sets, which means they show up both in Acts and in the letters of Paul, right? And the diagram that is on the right-hand side, that's the most extreme version, there the pattern is perfect, which means there are no toponyms where the action takes place, and they actually don't show up in the Pauline letters, right? So all the toponyms where action takes place show up in the Pauline letters. This is not what we observe. What we do observe is the diagram, which is second most on the right. That's where the big black arrow is, This is what we actually see. And what I'm saying is that the stronger the pattern, the stronger the piece of evidence, right? So if the pattern was only very weak, it would be weak evidence. It would be closer to a situation of random distribution, which is what we should expect on the hypothesis that, the author of Acts was a traveling companion of Paul. And as it moves further and further to perfect correspondence, the stronger the evidence is. The stronger it is as a piece of evidence, right? So I think we don't need it to fit perfectly. There can be exceptions. What I'm saying is that the less exceptions there are to this, the less the stronger evidence basically it is. And we just have one exception which we can't explain on this hypothesis. That's Beroe. So it's a still pretty strong piece of evidence, right? And Schellenberg offers a very obvious explanation, and that's the fact that there might have been a letter of Paul which was not preserved, but the author of Acts had access to it, which mentioned Beroe. So this is where the name of the place comes from. We don't have any evidence for it. Unfortunately, doesn't work perfectly, right? So that's one issue with it. The second issue is that this doesn't, his research, his paper actually doesn't take into account Paul's first missionary journey, right? So it only talks about Paul's missionary journeys in chapters 15 to 20, but it omits the first one. That would be Acts 9:3 and 15 to 35. I don't know why Schellenberg omits that. I haven't been able to find any justification for it in the actual article. He never says, okay, I'm omitting the first missionary journey for this reason. But the thing is that if you actually include the first missionary journey, it creates additional problems, right? Because it seems to me to be the case that there are some locations where action takes place, which are also not found in the Pauline letters. For example, the first missionary journey includes the island of Cyprus and the city of Salamis, not to be confused with the island of Salamis of the Battle at Salamis fame, right? Again, if you've played medieval Total War, Salamis is the settlement in Cyprus. And yeah, like it seems to me that if I use the methodology that Schellenberg is using for coding essentially the missionary journeys and identifying what counts as action, as significant action, I can come up with more examples that don't fit, right, the pattern that he's proposing. So it would actually weaken his case. But still, it wouldn't completely destroy it. It would just make the strength of the evidence smaller, weaker, right? We would have to come up with more explanations for why is it the case that the author of Acts is situating actions in locations that are not found in the extant Pauline letters. We would, for example, have to say, okay, there was a different letter of Paul that mentioned Paul in Cyprus, for example, right? Yeah. It obviously, of course, doesn't take into account Paul's journey to Rome, which isn't a missionary journey, but there are all kinds of geographical details and locations there. So again, that's weakness. And maybe the last problem is that it doesn't seem to me like 100% clear what counts as action under Schellenberg's schema, right, under his methodology. Because sometimes what seems to me to be only relatively minor activities, he counts as action, right? So I'm not sure if he's being completely consistent across the entire narrative, or whether he's like fudging the data a little bit to essentially generate a stronger fit. Right, so that would be my basic objections. Now some miscellaneous thoughts about it. First of all, the toponyms that he's working with mention also some toponyms that are found in forged epistles, specifically in First Timothy. I think this is really, really significant because, again, almost every New Testament scholar assumes that these forged Pauline epistles were written later than the letters of Paul. In some cases, the reason why they were written in the first place was precisely to resolve issues that only showed up after Paul by basically providing answers under this fake Pauline authority. Right? That was the reason why they were faked. Usually, like a lot of them are dated to the early 2nd century. So if Schellenberg is correct, that would mean that the author of Acts was writing when these forged letters were already around, which would make the hypothesis that Acts was actually written in early 2nd century more probable. That would be like one additional piece of evidence for this hypothesis. And this is something that I want to definitely stream about in the future. That's basically this idea that Acts were not written in 80s or 90s, but actually in like 120, 130, It's early 2nd century work. And Richard Pervo, for example, argues for it. There are some other scholars that argue for it. There recently was Acts seminar of the Jesus seminar fame. They also voted Acts into the beginning of the 2nd century, right? So this is interesting as like supporting piece of evidence. The usual pieces of evidence that are given is that the author of Acts is using Josephus, so that pushes it past 90 because that's when both of his works were published in Greek, which would be the edition that the author of Acts is using. And the second major piece of evidence is that Acts is actually anachronistic. The author is basically looking at church hierarchy, church organization that was already the case in early 2nd century when he was writing, and he is basically retrojecting it backwards in history, and he's depicting how it was actually around from the very beginning, right? So he's kind of providing the justification for structures, for hierarchical organizational structures that only really showed up much, much later, probably through gradual development. And the reason why we can say that this is anachronistic is because they don't actually show up in earlier sources, right? Like Didache or the letters of Paul, for example, like these offices and this various power structure of the early church. It's nowhere to be found in these early sources. And when it starts showing up in other, Christian literature, it's the beginning of the 2nd century. So it would kind of make sense that the author of Acts just, looked around him at his own time. He kind of assumed that the church hierarchy that he's seeing in his own time was already the case from the very beginning, or he was actually interested in providing a justification for how it came to be. Right. And the second thing that I want to talk about, which I've like second miscellaneous piece that I want to talk about, is actually my original contribution to this research question. This is something that I want to pursue. Maybe. I haven't decided, but I think it would make an interesting topic for a thesis because I need to, write a thesis at some point, and that would be an interesting question. And that's the idea that the author of Acts used a periplus. What is a periplus? Periplus is a special technical genre of ancient Greek literature. It's called either a periplus or periegeis. In both cases, it means something like sailing around. And it's a technical genre of literature, which is basically a map, only in a narration. So it describes in words what you would normally see on a map. It describes the shape of coasts, and it describes locations of various important places along coasts, what's in them, and usually what is the distance between these individual locations. And what was the point of writing something like this, right? Well, the point was obviously it was very practical. It was essentially an equivalent of a map, right? So it was written for sailors. They would have these periploi on board, and they would use them for navigation. They would know, okay, like 5 days ahead, there are these ports, and there are these things happening in these ports, so we can choose, whether we want to sail there or not. And they were also written for tourists. Seems to be right. Seems to be that eventually this genre kind of grew into essentially a genre of literature for armchair tourists. So they were not for people who actually went and visited these locations. They were actually like a replacement for vacation, for like physically traveling there, right? Because uh, navigating a sailing in antiquity was extremely dangerous, and people didn't usually want to do it if they could avoid it. And there was a demand for this kind of literature, like a description of like foreign lands, and what to find in them. And there you might ask a question, okay, why is it the case that they just didn't use maps, right? Well, it's because everything was copied by hand, which means everything usually was copied by people that were not qualified. Uh, for example, it seems to be that ancient books were actually copied by people who themselves couldn't read, because you don't actually need to be able to read in order to be able to copy letters, right? You don't have to know what the word says. You can just look at it and basically reproduce the shape. And of course, illiterate uh, labor is cheaper than literate labor. But that also meant that books usually couldn't have illustrations, because that would make it much, much more expensive to reproduce them, because you would need qualified scribes who can not only reproduce shapes of letters, but also reproduce illustrations, right? That would make the book much more expensive. So there is this pattern, or there is this trend in ancient literature that we see, that things that maybe in literature today would very obviously be depicted using a picture are actually described in words. And it's very often very impractical. There are some really like strange examples. For example, books on mathematics, like what in today's textbook on, for example, geometry would just be uh, visualized using a picture, is narrated, you know. And to be fair, there are like ancient manuscripts that have pictures in them. I'm not saying that no exists, right? They definitely do exist. It's just, you know, there was like much stronger tendency, much stronger tendency to provide this verbal description, right? There are verbal descriptions of machines. That's really interesting, right? So we have books on machinery, how to build like various things. And because they probably didn't and couldn't include any blueprints, they had to just basically describe every component of the machine and then describe how those individual components interacted, right? Again, very strange. And then imagine what happens if a scribe, like 500 years down the line, accidentally omits one line. Well, then you can't build the machine anymore, can you, right? Because you suddenly are missing part of the description. Another interesting example are star charts, right? So there were astronomers, obviously, in antiquity who recorded locations of stars, but they usually didn't draw star maps. They just tabulated them. And we have manuscripts of like insane books that have just like these tabulations of coordinates, basically, of stars on on like a night sky. And again, what happens, which is something, by the way, which happened very often, when a scribe makes a mistake when like reproducing a massive table of numerals. Well, the star charts don't no longer make sense, right? It's no longer usable scientific data. And that's how you get, for example, the Ptolemaic model of the solar system surviving all the way until early modern times, because the star charts that were copied from antiquity were just nonsensical, because there were scribal errors that basically corrupted the data. And there was even like a specific genre of literature called ekphrasis. It's more like it's not necessarily a genre, it's more like a literary practice, which is a very vivid description. For example, a description of a painting, right? And there were actually entire books written that were just descriptions of paintings. So you wouldn't buy like a collection of paintings or like a book that would have these paintings reproduced, because that would be extremely important. What you would normally buy is just a scroll with this extended exphrasis, and you would have it recited to you, and you would basically engage your imagination, and you would basically imagine how these like amazing paintings look like. Really weird, right? But that just comes from the this like limitation in writing techniques. But what I wanted to say is that like this is periplus, right? So technical genre, it's a verbal description of a coast. And what like the idea that I'm entertaining is that uh, there are obviously these locations where in acts that where no action takes place. The question is, why is it that the author of Luke, or the author of Acts, sorry, included them? Schellenberg suggests that it's for geographical verisimilitude. He basically wanted to make his narrative more lifelike. He wanted to make it seem more credible, right? It has been very often pointed out, for example, by Christian apologists, that these names of locations actually do make sense. They are, for example, when it describes that Paul went through A to B, and it mentions him going through 2 or 3 different locations, they are actually narrated in the correct sequence that a traveler going through A to B would traverse them, right? So there are no like it seems to be the case that there are no like geographical errors, right? It's not like they are narrated out of order, for example, unlike the Gospel of Mark. And there are kind of the natural stopping points. So those are the places where if you went, for example, from Greece to back to Syria and Palestine, those would be the locations where you would normally stop. And of course, apologists are saying this is amazing. This is like evidence for acts being historically reliable, and more specifically for acts being written by a traveling companion of Paul, because that's exactly what we would expect on the hypothesis that he was. But I'm saying, okay, this if the author of Acts also used a periplus, this is essentially like the box weighing 10 pounds. It's equally expected on both hypotheses, so it doesn't actually point in either direction, right? So I'm proposing letters of Paul plus a periplus. And I think there is some positive evidence. I'm not saying, okay, this is just the box weighing 10 pounds. I actually think there might be some positive evidence towards the hypothesis that the author of Acts used periplus, right? So I'm saying I can do better than just say, okay, 10 pounds is not evidence. I can essentially produce the box quacking. So I have something that is equivalent to quacking coming out of that box, right? So that would actually be like positive evidence for my hypothesis. And that's this. So there are these toponyms, these locations that don't show up in the letters of Paul. And I'm essentially saying that they are coming out of a periplus, that the author of Acts had a copy of the Pauline letters in one hand, a periplus in the other hand, and he was writing, he was composing the narrative of the missionaries' journeys out of that. I think on that hypothesis, it's very expected that all of the locations in black, so all of the locations that would be lifted from a periplus, where no action takes place, are located along the coast. Because a periplus would only have locations along a coast, right? It wouldn't have any locations inland. And I think this is really significant because Paul is not only traveling around the coast, he's traveling inland. And when he's traveling inland, there are no locations like this, right? When Paul is traveling inland, all of the locations that are mentioned are found in the Pauline letters. And I think this is expected on the hypothesis that the author of Acts was using a periplus. Because if he was using a periplus, he wouldn't have any names of places located inland to use, to incorporate into the narrative. That's the basic idea, right? So, for example, as I already mentioned, Paul twice visits Galatia. The author of Acts never mentions any specific city or any specific place in Galatia. And this is expected on the hypothesis that he's using a periplus, because Galatia is not a coast region, it's a region located inland. So he wouldn't have any names to draw from, right? But if he was a traveling companion, he would have names of specific places to name drop, right? Again, the problem is doesn't work perfectly. There is one specific location which is mentioned in Acts in the missionary journeys, but isn't mentioned in the Pauline letters, and it is inland, and it's Derbe. You can see it on the right-hand side of the map. And what's really interesting about it, actually, is that Derbe is mentioned in ancient literature. For example, Cicero mentions it. And it's mentioned disproportionately often, given how apparently insignificant it was. It wasn't like a major metropolis or anything like that. But for some reason, it shows up. I think, I'm not sure, that it's also mentioned in Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Maybe because Cicero happened to mention it, so the name kind of made rounds in subsequent ancient literature, right? And again, I'm not saying that you know the author of Acts was using like Cicero as a source. I'm just saying there is something weird about this location. That's why it shows up like disproportionately often, given how small town apparently it was. So there is maybe something to say there. And what is really interesting about this Periplus hypothesis, and by the way, this is like not completely new. Schellenberg also talks about it, like this is potential source. For example, we don't have, by the way, that many periploi. It's a genre of literature, unfortunately, from which almost nothing survives. To my knowledge, there is like one really good German critical edition of the various fragments of these periploi. It's like a very thick volume, but it's not an entire like bookshelf, right? Unfortunately. It's not like historiography where, yeah, I do have like an entire bookshelf full of ancient historians, just ancient historians. So we don't have that. But we, for example, have a periploi which is attributed to Scylax. It's known as Pseudo-Scylax. It wasn't written by Scylax. Scylax was a guy who wrote a periploi, and we have some fragments. But then there was a different periploi which almost completely survived. That's actually, I think, the largest surviving periplus. And it's just called Pseudo-Scylax because it was falsely attributed to Scylax, right? And what's really interesting is that this one source just happens to mention, for example, in like 2 paragraphs, all of the toponyms that are mentioned in Acts 16 and 17, specifically 16:11 and 17:1. So in one of this like cluster of names that shows up in Acts, where it's just narrating, where Paul went through, what do you know if we just like take one periplus that just happened to survive, and we look at one specific section, we find all of the same names, right? Because again, those locations would be the natural stopping points, so they would be mentioned by a periplus in a periplus, right? And of course, nobody's proposing that like this specific periplus that we have today is the one that the author of Acts used. That would be an amazing coincidence. The point is that it's like raises the plausibility that this is the kind of text that the author of Acts would be using, right? So it's not an original idea. It has been written about in a literature, but so far I haven't been able to find any specific, like extensive scholarship that has been done on that. I'm not aware of any book, for example, that would be written about it. So why not write it? Like I could do a thesis about how probable it is that the author of Acts use a periplus, and the conclusion could be not very, somewhat, or very probable, given like other considerations and stuff like that. So that's it. Let me see what's happening in the chat. And let's maybe talk about something a little bit different now. So let me guys know in the chat if you understood what I was talking about. Like press 1 if you follow. Was the presentation understandable? Like, do you get the basic idea of where I'm coming from and what like Schellenberg is talking about? Or is it just completely, I'm not saying that like it's too complicated for you guys to understand. Like if you don't get it, it's my fault. I'm the communicator, right? So yeah, okay, we have some ones in the chat. Cool. Now from like 1 to 100, how strong of an evidence do you think it is in favor of acts not being written by a traveling companion of Paul, right? So 0, it's terrible evidence, like nobody should ever talk about it again. 0, it's metaphysically certain, it's like logically necessary that given this evidence, the author of Acts was not a traveling companion. We have some 1.5, which probably means eh. So if you like it doesn't click exactly, what I can definitely recommend is rewatch this stream over and over so that you understand it, right? Okay, wow, 80 to 90. Trevor Lunn. I would not go that high. I honestly, I don't know what I think about it, right? Like when it comes to, and by the way, I have all kinds of material like this, you know, because what I do in my free time actually is that I go through just catalog like lists of issues of various journals in biblical studies, mostly having to do with the New Testament, right? Except for like New Testament Greek and crap like that. And I just like read through these articles that I find interesting, you know. So yeah, I have like entire pile of paper basically to talk about. So I hope you. And what I want to say is like I don't know what to think about this, right? Like I don't know how much I should be convinced by this because I haven't read as much of like the surrounding context to really make any strong judgment one way or the other, right? It could be the case that if we presented this to, for example, Robert Price, he would be able to say much more about that, right? Like I can imagine what he would probably say, given the positions that he holds, right? But yeah, like I don't know what to say about that. But I at least I hope that you appreciate the kind of content that you are getting on this channel, and dare I say only on this channel. So compare this more specifically, compare this to a presentation that someone like J. Warner Wallace or even Mike Lacona or Gary Habermas or William Lane Craig would give, you know? Like what these guys say are things like, well, it's so incredible that a carpenter from the first century would claim to be Yahweh that it must be the case. So that's the quality of the content that you're getting. And here we are just like big brain stuff, you know? We are sitting in chairs that are just growing out of our brains and we are hovering in like hot air balloons that consist entirely of our own brain, right? So yeah, Mike Lacona, my brain contains his. Yeah. So now, okay, 60 to 70, I think that's more reasonable. 66.6, yeah, that's it. I think that's like some evidence, at least a little bit. It's like a cumulative case, you know. You can make it a really good example of the, or you can make it a really good component of a cumulative case against the traditional Lukan authorship. And of course, I hope that you realize that like everything that you've learned in this like almost 2 hours is completely useless when it comes to talking to like Christians or even Christian apologists, you know, because there is, first of all, there is no way you would be able to present this in conversations. I wouldn't do it because it's like I had difficulty communicating it to you guys, and I can imagine you are probably a receptive audience. And then, yeah, I don't think they would like appreciate the quality of the argument, right? Yeah. Oh, we have an agnostic. As an agnostic Christian, I've used your argument by gaining that Yahweh exists and still having a low probability for the resurrection. Irish with some sun. That's really interesting. Yeah, we can talk about it a little bit more. Hi to Australia as well. Is Australia on fire this year again? There hasn't been. I think because of COVID, there hasn't been that many news about it. But I know, like last year, by the way, do you guys know that koalas are extinct? Like it's a matter of time before they die out. Like even though there are still like surviving members of the species, we now know that like it's just a matter of time before they go extinct because they don't have enough members basically to support the population. That's insane. Yeah. What separates a good cumulative argument from a bad one? Yeah, I have to do a stream where I criticize the flying man hypothetical. I've already, by the way, talked about it with Doug just privately because we chat. We used to chat much more than we do today, like nowadays, right? But I've actually like laid down some criticisms of the flying man analogy because I do think that there are instances where cumulative cases are perfectly fine, and actually cumulative cases are used all the time in history. I would say most of the time, because in history you don't really have like a silver bullet. It's usually not the case that like one thing conclusively proves a hypothesis, and you usually don't even have very very strong pieces of evidence. And if you do have that, those are the areas in history that historians don't write, books and journal articles about, because if it's very close to being conclusively proven or disproven, there's really no point to talk about it, right? So if you actually look at secondary literature scholarship in history, ancient history specifically, what you usually find are various authors advancing various arguments based on relatively weak evidence. And the strength of the argumentation is basically by showing how this evidence is unexpected on the competing hypotheses and how it is expected on the hypothesis that's being defended. How the hypothesis being defended has like a higher plausibility and stuff like that. Well, I, for example, had to write a short paper for a class on Julius Caesar, and it was on there are these like hypotheses about when the commentary on the Gallic War, when they were written, and specifically whether they were written all at the same time. That's one hypothesis, that basically Caesar narrated it over winter in winter of 51 to 50 BCE, in one specifically Gallic oppidum where his army was stationed overnight. And the alternative hypothesis is that actually the commentary were written over a longer period of time and in specific segments, right? So he wrote a first couple of books, then that was published in Rome, then he wrote a little bit more that was published in Rome, and eventually that was like collected into one body. We don't have any conclusive evidence for either, because in the ancient sources, for example, it never says anything about when and how exactly they were written, right? That's not a part of the reception in the primary sources. But it's actually interesting to see what kind of arguments contemporary historians of antiquity propose for these different hypotheses. And of course, it's not conclusive. It's just relatively like these individual pieces of evidence that are relatively weak on their own. But yeah, the strength of the argument is this cumulative case, But again, the cumulative case usually only goes so far. Like it doesn't move you, at least from my experience, it doesn't move you very far away when it comes to like being very certain, Like it usually makes one hypothesis more plausible. So if you, talk to historians, like actual historians, people who already have their PhDs, when you meet them at like conferences and stuff like that, they say, yeah, like this is probable, but we will never know, unless, of course, you are talking about hypotheses that are just like super intrinsically improbable, like resurrections and stuff like that, Okay, cool. So yeah, definitely there is going to be a stream about why the flying man is terrible. We have to start some controversy, because the key to success of every YouTube channel, behind every YouTube channel, is YouTube controversy. And Now I have like a small YouTube channel, so I need to grow by basically yeah. We can do like Steve McRae 2.0, and have like a massive fallout with Pine Creek Duck. I think that would be fun. Okay, so now let's talk about something completely different. I want to talk about ships because we were talking a little bit about um, Paul's missionary journeys, which involve a lot of sea travel. So I just found like some really interesting and hilarious examples of ships in ancient literature. One of them is found in Suetonius in the lives of uh, Caesars, specifically in life of Caius Caesar, which by the way isn't the the Caesar that everyone knows. It's actually Caligula, because Caligula was just a nickname. It means a military booth, uh, the kind of footwear that Roman legionaries would be wearing. He was given that nickname because he was raised, actually, he spent his childhood among soldiers because his father was a general, Roman general. But his like civil name and the way how he's described uh, to how he's described, how he's referred to in primary sources as Caius Caesar. So Suetonius actually mentions like names the life of Caius Caesar. But here he specifically says he, meaning Caligula, also built Liburnian galleys. That's a specific design of a ship. That's comes from a region in Italy, but it became like a. I think it's Italy. I could be wrong, but it was like a technical term for a kind of ship with 10 bunks of rows, with sterns set with gems, particolored sails, huge spacious baths, colonnades, and bulkhead halls, and even a great variety of wine and fruit trees, that on board of them he might recline at table from an early hour and coast along the shores of Campania amid songs and choruses. So this is a again from the biography of Caligula, and of course Caligula very infamous in history. He was portrayed as a very negative character in various historical writings, and Suetonius, as a historian, is very kind of tabloid. Like you will find a lot of spectacular descriptions of lives of these emperors, especially the bad ones like Nero and Caligula. And you will basically find the same type of content that today you would find in tabloid magazines. So depictions of very opulent, rich feasts, banquets, the kind of clothing, material wealth that these like decadent emperors basically surrounded themselves in, right? And why is he doing that? Well, obviously he's doing that because it's very sensational. He tries to appeal to his audiences, and people probably read these depictions basically for the same reason people read tabloids today. It's very attractive to read about scandalous affairs of like TV stars and movie stars and rock stars today. What is insert a name of pop culture figure? I don't know. I spent my time like reading this, so I don't know who's popular. Justin Bieber, probably. What is he doing now? Okay, that's basically an equivalent in ancient literature, of course. And there was this um, secondary like goal, obviously, basically incorporating or connecting the motif of material wealth with moral decadence, right? So people who are obviously um, surrounded by like material wealth and riches are going to be morally very corrupt. They will be cravenous, they are going to be lustful, and they will have all the other sins from Crusader kings too, right? Yeah, because there was obviously this very strong like sense of asceticism in ancient culture even before Christianity, and like people, for example, philosophers very often lived very ascetic lives. So this is kind of the opposite of that. Sounds like bullshit, right? These kind of ships that there were ships with like baths and trees and stuff like that. Well, actually, and this is the depiction in some later literature. Obviously, doesn't come from antiquity; comes centuries later. But this is how people imagined these ships look like, and this is a more modern reconstruction, right? So you can see that there are actually buildings and trees and stuff like that. Amazingly, we actually found two of those ships. They are called Nemi ships. So two were found in a lake at Lake Nemi, hence the name. Probably mispronouncing it in Italian. I don't know. It's just a volcanic lake in Latium, so it wouldn't be. These specific ships would not be sailing the Mediterranean or more specifically the Tyrrhenian Sea. They would be in on an inland lake in Latium. And what's interesting is that actually the wrecks of these ships were known, like people knew that they exist from at least 15th century. And apparently even local fishermen sold pieces of those fish to tourists. It's just they were too deep for people to excavate them. But in late 1920s, they were excavated and they were put in a museum. Unfortunately, in 1944, the museum was hit by a bomb. It was a US bomb, so thanks for that. And the remains of the ships were burned. So we have pictures, we have physical models, small scale models, but we unfortunately don't have the ships. And what's amazing is that not only were the ships found, some of the technology was found. For example, some of the leather pipes, uh, some of the piping used to circulate hot and cold water around the ship. Uh, like that kind of technology was lost at the end of antiquity as was only recovered in like late Middle Ages, right? So we have some amazing technological innovation. You can see that people in the ancient world were obviously extremely skilled when it comes to designing all kinds of machines, especially Romans. But unfortunately, those are were the kinds of applications that they could come up with, and not like the Industrial Revolution or something like that. And the second example is even more hilarious. It's a self-sinking ship. So here we have Tacitus narrating how Emperor Nero came up with a plot to assassinate his own mother, Agrippina the Younger. And he basically wanted to assassinate her in various ways. Like he considered various scenarios, but he thought that all of them are like too dangerous. It would He was probably surrounded by unreliable people, and there was a danger that the plot either wouldn't go through or his involvement would be exposed. He couldn't get sufficient plot power, right? And as you do, you design a self-sinking ship. So that was a ship specifically designed so that it could be sunk essentially on command. Uh, and the idea was that the ship would break apart at night during a banquet. And, it would have Nero's mother on it. So she would just die. And it would look like a ship sinking, which happened all the time. As I mentioned, sailing was extremely dangerous. So nothing extraordinary, nothing suspicious. But the problem is that a traitor basically divulged the plan to Agrippina, but Nero actually managed to soothe her, and she, boarded the ship. She was probably convinced because, let's be honest, the plot is like so ridiculous that it sounds very implausible. Yeah. So let's read about it. So that is this guy, explained to Nero that a vessel could be constructed from which a part might be by a contrivance detached when out at the sea, so as to plunge her unawares. Okay, so to plunge her unawares into the weather. Nothing, he said, allowed of accidents so much as the sea. And should she be overtaken by shipwreck, who would be so unfair as to impugn a crime to crime an offense committed by the winds and waves. The emperor would add the honor of a temple and of shrines to the deceased lady with every other display of filial affection. So again, like, who would blame you for a ship being sunk? That happens all the time, right? So yeah, uh, okay. So there was a banquet. At the agreed upon time, the mechanism was triggered, and this is what happened. When, at a given signal, the ceiling of the place, which was loaded with a quantity of lead, probably to make it heavy, fell in, and Creparius was crushed and instantly killed. Would make for an amazing action movie, right? Agrippina and Acheronia, so this is the empress and a maiden, like a lady, Acheronia or Acheronia, were protected by the projecting sides of the couch, which happened to be too strong to yield under the weight. But this was not followed by the breaking up of the vessel, for all were bewildered, and those two who were in the plot were hindered by the unconscious majority. The crew then thought it best to throw the vessel on one side and so sink it. But they could not themselves promptly unite to face the emergency, and others, by counteracting the attempt, gave an opportunity of a gentle fall into the sea. Acheronia, or Aceronia, however, thoughtlessly exclaiming that she was Agrippina and imploring help for the emperor's mother, was dispatched with poles and oars and such naval implements as chance offered. So she basically pretended to be the empress, and they killed her. Agrippina was silent and was thus the less recognized. Still, she received a wound in her shoulder. She swam, then met with some small boats which conveyed her to the Lacrine Lake, and so entered her house. So it basically failed. So the first, and as far as I can tell, the only plot to assassinate someone by building a self-sinking ship thus failed. I think Nero, as far as I remember, assassinated her nevertheless. Ooh, so here we go. That was awesome. So, what do you guys think? Sounds interesting. Are you entertained? Should we keep going for another 2 hours? I'll probably lose my voice tomorrow again, so let's not do that. Yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit about the future of the channel and like what I have in store, because there are some plans. Like now, I think this is basically viable. It's not a complete disaster, you know. There are people watching this, so I thought I will keep doing this, you know, like just random streams on various things that I find interesting in like biblical scholarship, you know. But then I want to give it a little bit more structure. So if you watch that stream that I did, that interview that I did on Myth Vision, that's basically an outline of my alternative explanation to the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection. And I want to do actually an entire series when we go in depth, because in no debate and no interview, I could be able to cover everything and go into, for example, primary sources. You know, like one of the things that I like to do and which I think sets me aside, apart from other channels, is that I show you quotes from, you know, ancient sources, primary sources, and we read them, because I think it's important for the primary sources to talk, you know, to them, to us, and you know, people normally don't read them. So I just think it's super cool. So I just want to have a series which would basically have like 50 different parts, where we could really pick apart every single thing that is proposed about the resurrection of Jesus by apologists, and we would just completely deconstruct it, you know, going through the various sources, looking at what various scholars think, you know. Like there would be probably an entire series just on the empty tomb, to be honest. So this is what I want to do. Then I want to do the like basic content, basically the bottom feeder content, and that's just reviewing material. That's, for example, what Pine Creek does. It's just like put up on Christmas time, put up some Christmas colors, and look at some Gary Habermas together. Everyone's favorite pastime activity over the holidays, right? And the reason why I want to do that is because, first of all, people are asking me to do that. They probably want to see what I have to say about that. And to be honest, that attracts attention. Like even now, my most popular videos are the ones that feature either in the headline or in the thumbnail, like a name or face of a popular apologist. So makes sense for me to do that. And then I have a surprise for you. That's a special format that I'm going to be starting probably when my exam period ends, because now in like immediately after Christmas, I will have to pass my exams to get to the next semester. But then I will start a completely new format. So every once in a while, it's already been done on YouTube. So, there is precedent. I actually want to continue something that was done by a different YouTuber, but he then abandoned the format. And as far as I can tell, nobody really has been continuing it. Not going to tell you what it is, but I think some of you will probably be able to guess. So that's it. Thanks for your attention, and see you next time.